Hello, this is Professor Nassar, and thank you for joining me today as we go through the anatomy of the kidney. This will be the first of 4 mini lectures on kidney anatomy. The first model we're going to look at is the small kidney model. So let's go through the parts. This is the kidney. On top is the adrenal gland, and then we can see a couple of other structures going into and out of the kidney. We have the renal artery, renal vein, and ureter. Where the renal artery, renal vein, and ureter all enter or exit the kidney is in this little concave portion here that is known as the renal hilus or hilum. If we flip the model over, we see basically these same structures. It looks something like this. Adrenal gland, kidney, ureter, renal artery, renal vein. Okay, next, let's open up the model and see what it looks like inside. What I'm going to do here is just raise my platform so that we can zoom in a little bit and see things in a little more detail. So I apologize, you're going to see basically a white screen for a moment or two while I raise this up and put the kidney model underneath and adjust our focus. The kidney is also, this is the isolated portion that's not on the stand. It's a little wobbly, so I'm just going to prop it here so it doesn't move around as much. And let me just adjust the focus so we can see a little better. There we go. All right, so this is the interior or an isolated section of the kidney. Let's go through the parts. We have the capsule on the outside, the cortex. This region here is the medulla. The medulla has a few different components to it. You notice some parts of the cortex basically go from the cortex and actually go into the medullary regions here, 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 and so forth, dividing the kidney into smaller lobes. These portions of the cortex that go down into the medulla are called renal columns. And they break up the kidney into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lobes. These triangular portions here that look sort of like dark candy corns are renal pyramids. The tip of the pyramid is called a renal papilla. There's a papilla there, another one here, and so on. These areas where you see the blood vessels sort of coming through that are filled in with fat, these yellow parts here, is the space that's essentially between the kidney portion and the vessels and the urinary portion that's draining all the urine. That fat-filled space is called the renal sinus. They show it here a little bit on this portion of the model, and there's also a little bit of it here that's hard to see because this is a small model that's between the blood vessels and the capsular wall of the kidney, this space here. And then this region would be the hilus. Okay, so that's the kidney side. Now let's look at the urinary side, the portion of the kidney that is draining the urine. So from within the renal pyramid, the renal pyramid consists of a number of small little tubules that are collecting urine. And that urine basically goes from the renal pyramid to the papilla and then goes drip, drip, drip into these little collecting regions here, these little cup-like regions that are called, each cup is called a calyx. The plural of calyx is calyces or calyces. Each one of these little calyces is called a minor calyx. So under every renal papilla is a minor calyx. There's one here, 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 and so on. The minor calyces then collect to form a major calyx. So there are 2 major calyces. There's one roughly about where you see this circle here. These minor calyces all drain into a major calyx on this side, and the minor calyces here all drain into a major calyx that I would put maybe right about there. The two major calyces then drain into a larger collecting area that's called the renal pelvis, and that's this region right here. The renal pelvis then drains out through the ureter. The ureter is not shown here on this part of the model. It would start right about here. Next, let's look at the blood vessels. So the renal artery would be somewhere out about here. Then that would branch into what are called segmental arteries. We can see two of them right about there. The segmental arteries then would be on the lateral side of this model, on the outside, so we can't really see them here, but we can see their continuation here as they move up through the renal columns. As they go up through the renal columns, they're basically going between the various lobes of the kidney, and so these blood vessels and the arteries and the veins are called the interlobar vessels. This is the interlobar artery, interlobar vein. These vessels then go up and form an arc-like shape between the cortex and the medulla. You can see part of it here, another part here, another part here and here. These are called the arcuate arteries, and they are a nice landmark to let you know that, especially when you're looking at the histology, where you are on the kidney. If you can find your arcuate arteries, they usually lie at the boundary between the cortex and the medulla of the kidney. From the arcuate arteries, the blood vessels go further up into the cortex, and these portions are called the cortical radiate arteries. And that's what all of these branches that you see here are. The veins, I'm not going to go through because they are satellite to the arteries, meaning that they are named the same as the arterial blood vessels. Next, let's look at the other half of the kidney that was on the stand. Just give me a minute while I get this set up. Okay, let me just look at the focus here. Yeah, it's pretty good. Let me just slide the camera over a little bit. Okay. Great. Okay, this is the interior section of the kidney. And let's go through the parts one more time. We have the capsule on the outside, then the cortex, and then the medulla. The medulla consists of renal columns, renal pyramids, sometimes called medullary pyramids, and then the papilla. The sinus is the fat-filled space. There would normally be fat here and here. They did not include that on this model, but normally this area has a little bit of fat, and the fat occupies the renal sinus. And then this area is the hilus. Minor calyx, or minor calyces, they drain into the major calyx here, and major calyx here. Then the major calyces drain into the ureter, which would drain right about there, and we can see the continuation of it here. The blood vessels, the renal artery is you can just start to see it here on this bottom part of the model. And then it branches to the segmental arteries, interlobar, arcuate, and then cortical radiate. The nice thing about this model is it also has a little bit of the nephron shown here too. Now these details are rather small, and we will look at this in more detail in a larger kidney model. But for now, let's just see what we can witness, we can view. Recall that the nephron has two parts to it. The nephron of the kidney is this region that we see here outlined in white. The nephron has two parts. There is this ball-like region that's called the renal corpuscle, shown here and here. And then there is this long tubular region here and here that consists of a very tiny tube, and we call those the renal tubules. So the nephron has two parts. The renal corpuscle is part one, and part two is the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle has two components to it. The first component is this little tuft of capillary bed that's called the glomerulus. The glomerulus is basically the continuation of these arcuate arteries, of these cortical radiate arteries. As the cortical radiate arteries go up, make their way up through the cortex out towards the capsule, they give off little side branches that are called afferent arterioles, not shown in this model. The afferent arterioles, if you imagine like this cortical radiate artery like the trunk of a tree, there would be branches coming off periodically going 90 degrees to this that we call the afferent arterioles. And then the afferent arteriole then makes a little tuft of a capillary bed that we call a glomerulus. And that tiny little red ball there and this tiny little red ball here represent a glomerulus. The glomerulus is surrounded by part of the nephron that's called the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule together form a structure called the renal corpuscle. So the glomerulus is this little structure here in red, and the glomerular capsule is the structure here in white that's sort of forming the letter C. And on this side, it's forming sort of the backwards letter C. From there, the nephron continues from the glomerular capsule or the Bowman's capsule. It continues as part of the tubule. The tubule has basically three parts. There is a proximal convoluted tubule, which is not really shown here because of they had to take some artistic liberty, but it would be roughly about here. Then there's a part that basically descends down into the medulla and back up, forming a loop. This is called the nephron loop. You can see part of it here. There's a descending part and an ascending part of this nephron loop that's also known as the loop of Henle. It's also shown here a little more clearly. Here's the renal corpuscle. The proximal convoluted tubule would be roughly about there. This is the nephron loop, the descending and ascending portions. And after that, we get to the distal convoluted tubule, which would be roughly about here, and on this side, roughly about there. The distal convoluted tubule continues as what's called a tiny little portion called a connecting tubule, and then the connecting tubule connects to this longer tube that drains, filtrate down through the medulla and ultimately down into the calyx. This long tubule is called the collecting duct. We can see the collecting duct here and the collecting duct on this side. When the collecting duct reaches the papilla, it gets renamed as the papillary duct here and here. Along the way, as the collecting duct makes its way down, it collects more urine from other neighboring nephrons through their connecting tubules. So the collecting duct makes its way down. It gets renamed as the papillary duct once it's collected urine from the other neighboring nephrons, and then that urine drains into the minor calyx. Okay, that's it for the anatomy of the small kidney model. Next, we'll move on to the anatomy of the large kidney model. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you found that helpful.